Hello, this is Jeffrey Tucker of Brownstone Institute. Today I'm going to go solo on the Brownstone Show and present to you an article that I had written a couple of weeks ago, then presented as Supper Club, and will present again in front of some serious historians and experts in the coming weekend. And I'm really fascinated with your own response to it. What it is a reconstruction of the history of a certain kind of medical injury. Before I do that, I do want to say something about our supper clubs. We're now up to a dozen. You can go to the website now and look at upcoming events, click on the map, find one close to you, register to go enjoy a nice dinner with some drinks, with some nice friends that are associated with Brownstone Institute. We opened up the supper clubs to a larger geography beyond that which it had originally been born. And we did this in November and December, and sure enough, now we have a dozen supper clubs around the country with their own, each one of which has its own host. Very exciting. This is all in an attempt to put back together the sense of community, friendship, collegiality that was shattered so brutally during the COVID period. So this is kind of an experiment for us. And wow, I say it seems to be working. So click on upcoming events and find a supper club near you and hang out, get to know some new people. The diversity of people who come to these things is really quite remarkable. And not everybody agrees on everything, but it turns out that's kind of a wonderful thing to hang out with people with different, smart people with different points of view. That's the whole idea, isn't it? Now, I mentioned my topic today is going to be a certain form of medical injury. You might have already guessed that I will be speaking about vaccines. Okay, yeah, I know it's a taboo topic. Anytime anybody raises a question about any shot, you get screamed at and yelled at as an anti-vaxxer, biased, you're trying to ruin public health, you're the enemy of the people, how dare you be anti-science, and so on and so on it goes. There's this strange sort of high dudgeon associated with this topic, and I had never really understood why that would be. If you think about vaccines as just a consumer product, either it works or it doesn't, or it's good for you or it's bad for you. The same way a chair or a hamburger or any other consumer product might be, there's not a lot of concern over it, and your opinions on it don't really matter that much. But it comes to vaccines, suddenly all bets are off. It's like there's a mandatory regime that everybody has to believe in anything that happens to be called a vaccine and never doubt that it's overall good for the American public. So I began to look back at some of the history of vaccination and in the United States in particular. Now, my comments don't reflect the world experience, which might be different. I don't know. I can only speak to the American experience. But the American experience is really quite riveting, even from the earliest time when Edward Jenner first invented vaccination. It was in 1796. Now, when I say invent, what does it really mean? Because there was a thing called variolation, which had been used for a long time before. This was mostly to mitigate against the spread of smallpox. Smallpox is the single most feared disease on the planet Earth, particularly in the Americas. Americans were gravely concerned about smallpox, not only for the outbreaks that would happen in cities and cause thousands, if not tens of thousands of deaths, terrible, horrible deaths, but the colonial settlers from the 17th century and even earlier had brought over to an immunologically naive population of American natives, both in the United States, what became the United States, but then also in Latin America, and led to a vast death. And we don't actually have any way of determining just how vast, but was half, was it 2/3, was it 90%? of the native population wiped out by smallpox due to immunological naivety? We don't actually know, but it was an unexposed population, unexposed to not just smallpox, but many other diseases that Americans brought over with them, leading to vast deaths. So there was a tremendous concern about smallpox. Variolation was used during the American Revolution. Typically, war times give rise to grave disease fears and extreme efforts to try to stop the spread of infectious disease, because obviously infectious disease disables whole armies and can lead to dramatic geopolitical consequences. So there's always been a strong effort to try to control infectious disease during wartime. In the Revolutionary War, the War for American Independence, variolation was common. Variolation comes by going to a smallpox victim, taking off the scabs, cutting some incisions, and rubbing the scabs to expose the patient to smallpox. This is deeply dangerous and leads to a lot of death. I mean, let's just say it was 1%, 5%, 10%. We don't know, but it was very dangerous. But some people took the risk because smallpox was actually worse. Variolation was a very common practice. What Edward Jenner had discovered is that he could use a much lesser form of smallpox, namely cowpox, which was not as injurious to the human, and in effect variolate with a cowpox pus and create immunity for smallpox. In effect, what's interesting about this is this what's called the discovery of vaccination is not a method of administration, because that took another 50, 60 years before injections were invented. It was the discovery of the two things: the discovery of the cross immunity from cowpox to smallpox, meaning that you could get a less dangerous exposure, leading to the immune response that would protect you against a more severe disease. This was a discovery that, though it had been known in folklore for quite a long time, it was Edward Jenner who used, as they said, scientific methods to discover and prove it in a real life case. The second thing that was discovered is that you could pass immunities person to person rather than just directly from cows. It could be passed from person to person. This gave an entire generation a great enthusiasm for the potential of vaccination, named after the Latin for cow, to the whole population, to lead to the protecting people from smallpox in particular. And for reasons I don't entirely understand, because you've got to keep in mind there's the 18th century where practices such as bleeding, a person's sick with an infectious disease, and so you slice open their arm and drip the blood into a bucket to drain out the bad humors or whatever. That was a very common practice, and it had been for centuries. Vaccination was widely seen as evidence that Enlightenment principles of science could work. And there was a great deal of excitement about this on both sides of the pond. I mean, Thomas Jefferson himself, sort of classic Enlightenment intellectual type, wrote Edward Jenner a letter saying, your name's going to go down in the history of science as, one of the great men, one of the great achievements of all time, God bless you, and so on. It was a very affectionate letter towards Jenner. And so it became kind of, I guess you would say, part of the fabric of American experience with infectious disease, that vaccination in particular would be seen as a great, great thing. Now, obviously, this has been going on now for 225 years. If you've had a chance to read Aaron Series' book, Vaccines, Amen, you'll see that clearly a fully uncritical attitude towards anything and everything called a vaccine is not warranted. by the science. I encourage you to read that book. I think it's one of the most interesting books I've ever encountered, and it leaves you with a sense of shock and sadness and almost doom about how little tested, for example, most of the shots that are on the childhood schedule are today, and most everything we call vaccination has not been thoroughly vetted for effectiveness or safety. That's, I guess, the burden of the book. So my investigation here was trying to trace out how we got to this point where we're so culturally uncritical towards it. I mean, like it's even to the point that opening up a video on this topic makes me personally nervous. Maybe it's because I'm rather new to the topic. I have to say that when the COVID lockdowns first happened, I was obviously a wild opponent of it. I mean, I couldn't believe that they were trying to control infectious disease by urging you to hop under your sofa and stay there for the duration, and not have any house parties. I knew that was wrong for a number of reasons. One is a fast mutating respiratory virus with a zoonotic reservoir cannot be eradicated or even controlled by reducing the R naught through social isolation. That's absurd. The virus doesn't have anywhere to go. It's still going to be out there. As soon as you unlock down, it's going to spread just as it spread before. So this whole thing struck me as crazy. But one thing I hadn't really considered is the possibility that medical science would attempt to invent an inoculation against this pathogen that they thought would be effective. I didn't even imagine that they would ever attempt such a thing, because a fascinating mutating virus with a zoonotic reservoir is something against which no one ever thought vaccines were suitable, were effective, because vaccines need a stable pathogen, the one that lends itself to vaccination, like smallpox or chickenpox or mumps or measles. SARS-CoV-2 was a very different thing entirely, so I couldn't believe that it was happening. By the time the vaccine came along, and I was sort of putting it down as a ineffective measure, I was called an anti-vaxxer. Well, I never even heard of an anti-vaxxer. Or at least they didn't have anything like a big presence in my mind. I had no reason to think that there was ever a reason to be an anti-vaxxer. I was like, what would give rise to such a thing? I had no previous experience with interacting with people that had doubts about vaccination. So when I began to speak out about it, I got called this name all the time. And again, with this sort of maudlin high dudgeon that I couldn't quite follow. So part of these historical investigations were to look back at maybe the origins of these things. So let's go back in history. Edward Jenner invents vaccination. Thomas Jefferson writes him a letter saying it's the greatest thing ever. Now let's bump forward to the War of 1812. Okay, so we've got another war. We've got a lot of disease fears in the air. A doctor by the name of James Smith, who had become something of a proponent of vaccination and a collector of vaccines, in fact, wrote a letter to President James Madison saying, listen, don't worry, I got it under control. Just let me take care of it. I've got plenty of vaccines for everybody, especially for the troops who might have experienced some unfortunate exposure. Just trust me on this. So James Madison in 1813 passes the Act to encourage vaccination. Very interesting, because the historical records show, federal government was really small at the time, right? 1813, well, it didn't do much. It was like a new government. It wasn't really doing that much. Yeah, they tried the Sedition Acts in 1800. Those went away. And Sedition Acts, those were repealed. So the government was not big. It was not invasive. But here you had, under James Madison, the federal government putting its full weight and confidence behind a single medical product, a consumer product, for the first time in American history. Nothing like this had ever happened. In fact, vaccines were the very first product on the medical marketplace or any marketplace to get a full-scale endorsement from the federal government. Isn't that interesting? Very interesting. Let's bump forward a little bit in time. Obviously, these vaccines in the early days were not entirely safe. James Smith having the entire monopoly for on these things. There was a lot of injury that began to pile up after this vaccination. And by 1822, a certain incident happened that caused Congress to completely repeal the act. By the way, I should just be clear about what this act did. Act to encourage vaccination wasn't just encouraging vaccination. It was a promise to give vaccines away to anyone who wanted them, with a particular focus on soldiers, of course. Anybody who wanted a vaccine could get a vaccine free of charge, and it would be mandatorily delivered by the Pony Express from James Smith's laboratory. That's what it was. So a huge subsidy. So already by 1813, you have an indication this is not going to be a normal consumer product. Why would we need a guarantee from the federal government to essentially pay for all vaccines that anybody would need, and then a mandate that they must be delivered from a single monopoly provider, namely James Smith, who you might say is the Fauci of his time, shall we say. Well, yeah, just to illustrate how unusual this is. In 1904, the hamburger was displayed at the World's Fair. I think it was in Chicago. And to a lot of hoopla, and everybody's really excited about it. Now, if the president, who was president at the time, had sent out an act to encourage hamburger eating, that might have sent out certain triggers. Why would you need government to? If the hamburgers are so great, don't they just take care of themselves? Won't people just eat them and enjoy them? And do we really need the federal government involved in pushing a consumer product on these people? So you see what I mean? There's already something slightly sketchy and strange about this. Behind which was a kind of disease fear, right? A germophobia, and also a confidence that with vaccination, we could control the spread of smallpox. Also, again, to reiterate my point, there was a perception in the air that vaccination was modern, it was scientific, it was a product of the Enlightenment, it grew out of the use of evidence instead of folklore, therefore should be trusted by a modernized people that believe in science. So you have, even from the very beginnings, you have many of the themes that we experienced over 2021 to the present, already present in 1813. Well, why did Congress repeal the act? Well, it seems there was a tremendous amount of injury and death. In particular, the annals of history record the Tarboro tragedy, in which James Smith, Mr. Science, got samples mixed up in his laboratory and sent out smallpox virus instead of cowpox vaccine to Tarboro, North Carolina. It caused a huge outbreak, infecting 60 people and 10 deaths. Well, this was just too much. So that was the end. The whole thing was done. No more focus on vaccines. And so things were between 1822 and the outbreak of the Civil War. Here we have again wartime conditions and rise of disease fears, and a particular fear that if the troops got infected with smallpox and it spread, it could affect the outcome of the war. So once again, you had a big push by both the Northern armies and the Southern armies to get those soldiers vaccinated. And I'm going to just explain to you here from this courtesy of the historian Terry Reimer, who writes about what happened during the war. I'm just going to read to you. Unfavorable results from vaccination or spurious vaccinations were all too common. Even pure vaccine obtained from official army dispensaries sometimes caused complications. Sometimes faulty preservation of the crusts could have compromised their effectiveness. Of course, it's not so easy to vaccinate. Not so easy. As is the case even with modern vaccines today, occasionally the vaccine did not take, failing to produce the major reaction at the vaccination site that was expected. In other cases, the site of the vaccination became overly sore and swollen. Abnormal pustules developed, leaving surgeons to question whether those vaccinations had been effective. Complications from using a scab from a recently vaccinated adult were even more deleterious, since many vaccinations took place in hospitals. Crusts from men who were sick with other conditions. Did you think about that? Maybe they might be sick with something else, and maybe their scabs carry other diseases. This is occasionally and used unintentionally, spreading diseases rather than preventing it. Often, soldiers in hospitals or prisons didn't get vaccinated until smallpox had already appeared in the facility, increasing the risk for some who might otherwise have been exposed to the disease. Perhaps the worst and unfortunately common form of spurious vaccination was the use of scabs that were syphilitic in nature. This occurred both in the hospitals and among soldiers who self-vaccinated. Misdiagnosing a scab or harvesting crust from the arm of a soldier who had syphilis would spread this disease to everyone vaccinated from that source. In one notable case, 2 brigades were affected by a vaccination infection they thought to be syphilitic in nature. The men were so sick that the brigades were unfit for military service. That epidemic was traced to a single soldier who had obtained vaccination material from a woman who had syphilis. There we go. Well, that was the experience of the Civil War. So you see what's happening here. You had it already start to develop in 1813, a sort of public skepticism. Wait a minute. Maybe I'm better off taking my risks with smallpox. Maybe I believe I have immunity to smallpox. Maybe herd immunity will protect me from smallpox, but I'm not sure that I really want to take a risk with these sketchy products that you're pushing on me. How do I know for sure that James Smith can be trusted and didn't get his samples mixed up in the laboratory? How do I know for sure the scab you wanted me to rub on my arm isn't infected with other pathogens like the dreaded syphilis? How do I know that? So there was a great deal of skepticism towards vaccination, and the response to the skepticism was always the same. More encouragement, more pressure, more subsidies, free delivery, mandates for soldiers, fear-mongering, pushes, propaganda. This, after all, is a product of the Enlightenment. Do you doubt the science? Are you skeptical of this great achievement? Are you trying to kill grandma? Right? It's been this way from 1813 throughout the Civil War. Well, I don't find any records. What happens after the Civil War? This is where it gets interesting. As if that wasn't interesting enough. So after the Civil War, I don't find any real records of any vaccination pushes. The country had undergone an unbelievable industrialization from the 1870s all the way through the 1890s and 1900, with the advance in communications and the telegraph, the telephone, the arrival of the commercialization of steel, which allowed bridges to be built in places that otherwise were unsustainable with iron. Steel allowed skyscrapers to start to emerge, buildings getting taller. Progress was all around. Electricity, homes were we got electricity, first the rich, then everybody. Electrification seemed to be the future. So there was a kind of a love baked into the Gilded Age in the US, or the Victorian period in the UK, and this idea of progress and a belief that it was inevitable. And anybody who resisted was crazy. and that science, engineering, and expertise were going to be the path to building a bright future. You see, that was part of the ideology that developed during the last quarter of the 19th century. Vaccination became part of this. I was reading through some of the early journals of the pharmaceutical industry from 1902, and what you have with the hope of vaccination was not just the eradication of disease or the control of disease, generally speaking, because after all, now we had the tetanus shot. Tetanus was a big deal. It's a huge deal. Caught mostly by rusty nails from horses in city streets. Tetanus was very, very terrible. Now we have a tetanus vaccine. We have diphtheria vaccines. So 2 additional products in the lineup. The pharmaceutical industry was wild with enthusiasm. I found an editorial from the American Druggist that said, this is it's one of the top guys writing. There is apparently no inherent reason why man should die, except our ignorance of the conditions governing the reaction going on in his protoplasm. The problem can be fixed by the artificial synthesis of living matter, with, of course, vaccination on the front row. Now, here I want to give some of the context. I think this is very, very interesting. The usual line, because now we're bumping into the progressive era. Let me just ask you to name the product that was first regulated for its quality during the progressive era to guarantee consumers something safe out of something that had been previously considered dangerous. Almost anybody who asks this question has a modicum of historical understanding will immediately answer it was meat packing. Okay? So Sinclair Lewis, 1904, writes the great book, The Jungle. I believe it was 1904. Writes The Jungle, exposing the Chicago meatpacking industry and its horrors. And the federal government gets alert to this and begins to regulate the meat packers and send in federal meat inspectors for the very first time. This is the very first product in America, the first consumer product that was subject to this kind of regulation. And under Teddy Roosevelt, they passed a meatpacking act that led ultimately to the creation of the FDA and so on and so on. Now, I have to tell you that this story is largely fake. What actually happened is that once the Sinclair Lewis book came out, The Jungle, exposing the meatpacking industry, the meatpacking industry went into massive disrepute. Consumption of their product fell by 50%. They went into an industrial collapse as a result of this expose. And people were starting to trust the farmers again. Like, okay, if you slaughtered the meat and you've packed the meat, then I'll buy it from you. But I'm not going to go to these crazy meat packers. What do they know? Farmers know more than meat packers. Well, the meat packers went to Washington and said, we desperately need you. We desperately need you to shore up public confidence in our product. Send us inspectors who can come look at our plant, pretend to coerce us and twist our arms. We'll go, oh, we give up. Yes, we'll subject ourselves to your great expertise. Then put a stamp of approval on our meat, and then that will shore up public confidence. That's the actual story of what happened to the meatpacking industry. It's not well known, but it's a fact. In other words, it was an industrial effort. It was not a product of a populist consumer revolt begging Washington to save us from the meatpacking industry. it was just the reverse. It was the meatpacking industry begging Washington to save it from a consumer revolt. Well, okay, just that's the actual. If you're curious about this deeper history, there's an article on Brownstone by Murray Rothbard that goes into this. And another great historian of the period of the progressive era is Gabriel Kolko. His wonderful book called The Triumph of Conservatism describes all the legislation of the progressive era as essentially being industry going to government to shore up its cartel, its credibility, regulate us, please, so that the public will trust us more. That seems to be the actual story. Now, I only tell that part of the story because it becomes important for the next part of the story, which is this. It wasn't meatpacking that was the first major consumer product that was subject to direct quality controls by the federal government. It was vaccines. Wouldn't you know it? The story goes like this. There was a wave of death in several major cities in 1901 as a consequence of compromised vaccines, bad delivery, whatever, the usual story, dozens of deaths, many dozens of deaths, thousands of injuries from 1901, which caused another round of public collapse in confidence in vaccination. And wouldn't you know it, it was the vaccine industry itself, the pharmaceutical industry, that went to Washington and begged that Congress and the president get behind what's called the Biologics Control Act of 1902. Now, here I'm going to cite some very interesting research called Early Developments and Regulation of Biologics by Terry S. Coleman, appearing in Food and Drug Journal in 2016. It's an extraordinary piece. He talks about the many deaths and infections from smallpox and other pathogens that hit Philadelphia, Atlantic City, Cleveland, Bristol, Connecticut. And the reputation of the industry was in free fall, and something had to be done. Histories of the 1902 Act generally describe it as simply, I'm quoting here, describe it as simply a congressional response to St. Louis and Camden incidents, as if the law was the outcome of some routine congressional process. In actual fact, the 1902 Act was an initiative of the large biologics manufacturers, and it was enacted with the secret cooperation of the Public Health Service. Now, here I'm going to quote some more. The biologics industry sought passage of the 1902 Act primarily because it feared that the contamination incidents would cause additional state and local health departments to make their own vaccines and antitoxins, wiping out the commercial biologics business of the main providers. So the Journal of the American Editorial Association, I read all this stuff. I mean, I went through and dug through all these stuff because I'm so intrigued by it. So I was reading the American Medical Association editorial as that if necessary, legislation should be had forbidding the sale or use of antitoxin not tested and certified by some competent authority. And the New York Times called for more intensive inspection and supervision of the commercial biologic producers. And the 1902, the Conference of State and Provincial Boards of Health in North America recommended vaccines should be provided either by governments or by private producers under the closest supervision of qualified governments. So there you go. The leading manufacturer at the time was Parke-Davis. This is the company that sought to reduce competition by establishing strict government standards that small producers would have a hard time meeting. In other words, they're trying to use the government to create a cartel. It's an old story. So Coleman finally comments, it's impossible to disentangle the desire for strict regulations to boost public confidence in biologics from the desire for such regulations to eliminate competitors. But it's noteworthy that several biologic producers went out of business because they were unable to pass the inspections. Okay. This company, by the way, Parke-Davis, was acquired
in 1970 by Warner Lambert. And in 2000, Pfizer acquired Warner Lambert in a $90 billion merger, the largest pharmaceutical acquisition in history at the time. And this brought Parke-Davis under Pfizer's umbrella. Okay, so here you have it. It was Pfizer, what we call Pfizer today, that was mainly responsible for the passage of the 1902 Biologics Control Act. What happened to the Biologics Control Act? Well, it created an agency that eventually was named, I think by 1930, the National Institutes of Health. In other words, people complain about industry being captured by, or agencies being captured by industry. My friends have some news. These agencies were created by the industry. They've always been captured. The unwelcome guests at the party are people like Robert F. Kennedy and Jay Bhattacharya that are trying to disentangle industry interests from genuine public health concerns. In doing this, they're fighting a fight that goes back 125 years. Let's go forward just a couple of more incidents. 1905, Jacobson decision in Massachusetts. A guy didn't want to get smallpox, a vaccine. The federal government said, or the Supreme Court said, you have to get the vaccine or pay the fee. Fee was fairly low, but nonetheless, that established a precedent for vaccine mandates. So here again, you've got this product, pre-delivery, free for everyone. You must get it because you're a soldier. Here's our new agency guaranteeing the product safety and quality. And now you have in 1905, the Supreme Court saying, it doesn't really matter if you have your doubts about this. What really matters is that you have to get it to protect public health. Your freedom is freedom, really, because your freedom to say no to vaccination could mean the ill health of others. So you might have to make a sacrifice. Now, here you get to another feature of vaccine ideology, or what's emerged as vaccine ideology, which is its utilitarianism, right? Greater good for the greater number. It's always been part of the thing. Under herd immunity theory, you have to get a certain percentage vaccinated in order to protect those who can't, that are too poor to be vaccinated, or too out of reach to be vaccinated, or too old or something. So you need the maximum number of people to get vaccinated in order to protect everybody else. And that could lead to injury. It could even lead to death, but you're the egg that made the omelet, as they say. So utilitarian thinking. That was 1905. Well, I don't have to tell you the rest, but vaccine injury has been a feature of this industry that didn't really even get going for the public at large until after World War II. You think about it. Vaccination was invented in 1796. It takes till after World War II before we have mass distribution of vaccines, along with a long history of vaccinations, vaccine injury in the 50s, in the 60s, and all the way to the 1970s. I myself was nearly vaccinated with a swine flu vaccine that was being championed by, I believe it was Gerald Ford at the time, resulted in a lot of injuries. So it was pulled off the market because it was deemed to be unsafe. I remember going to school that day expecting to get jabbed, and I was terrified. All the other students in the classroom were terrified. And the announcement came on the loudspeaker that the vaccine has been withdrawn. And I recall very well that everybody cheered. What's fascinating to me about that memory is the extent to which it reveals something about mass vaccination in general. There has always been public resistance. It's never been treated as a normal consumer product. After that incident, the swine flu vaccine, I'm going to say it was 1976, 1977, you had the Bayh-Dole Act come along in 1980. That was a big shift because what it allowed was pharmaceutical companies to share patents with the NIH. It was championed by people on the right as a form of privatization. But you see what's going on here. The regulators were ever less willing to give a pass on these shots for fear that it would lead to too much injury and death. If you could share the patent with the agency back and forth, now you've blown open a major, you've eliminated a major path to resistance. Now you have the agencies, in particular scientists within the agency, who have a fiduciary relationship with the manufacturer. That was seen as just this glorious thing. 6 years later, you have the what amounted to the ultimate disaster, which is the widespread indemnification of the industry itself. So long as you could get on the childhood schedule, you were indemnified. Now, the word at the time, meaning that you had a liability protection, the word at the time was, listen, guys, we need this liability protection, or else we're going to fail to exist in it as an industry. Now, was that hyperbole? I don't know. I mean, maybe it wasn't hyperbole. Maybe the industry was on the verge of collapse. As far as I can tell, looking back all the way to the founding period, the industry has always been on the verge of collapse. It's not even clear that you have a sustainable market demand in place without the mandates and the assurances from federal agencies, without the indemnifications, without the sharing of royalties, without the propaganda, without the utilitarian philosophizing, without this gigantic apparatus that doesn't exist for anything else, as far as I can tell. It doesn't exist for chairs and hamburgers and bottled water. They don't need all this stuff. It's just vaccinations that is constantly relied on these government mechanisms to shore up public acceptance. So 1986, and I don't have to go through the rest of the history here, 1986, that's when the childhood schedule blew up from just a handful of shots to, I think, until very recently, until the ACIP committee, until HHS acted and cut them down from 82 back down to a slightly more manageable level. But still, we're doing 3 times, 4 times the amount of vaccination they did when I was as a kid as a consequence of this indemnification. Just one quick note about this, because thinking back in time, in the mid-1980s, when the liability protection was for the vaccine manufacturers got through Congress, I remember this very well because there was said to be within the world of conservative and Republican ideology a liability crisis. There were frivolous lawsuits that were clogging up the courts. The lady spilled hot coffee from the McDonald's on her lap. Oh, now she's suing the manufacturer. How can free enterprise work under these conditions of strict liability? This is crazy. We need some limits. We need industry to be able to have some kind of control over this litigation, or else they're going to be bankrupted with litigation costs, and the courts will no longer function because they're going to be flooded with lawsuits. Okay. Well, it really came right down to it. There was only one industry that ended up getting full liability protection and indemnifications. No surprise, it was vaccines once again. So here's the mystery that I'm curious about, and I look back at this history dating all the way back to James Madison and his act to encourage vaccination. Is this a viable industry? Is it really? And if it is, on what scale? Now, there's no question, I don't think, that Edward Jenner's innovation was real. It was something. It's nice to know about cross immunities from less dangerous pathogens to more as a protection against more dangerous pathogens. And perfect, and in theory, it all works. In practice, does it? And is there really enough consumer demand for these products, especially these days, to be able to sustain such a mighty industry? There are some forms of vaccination that are absolutely essential that I promise you, even if you hated vaccines, you would take. If you suddenly got bit by a rabid raccoon, which happens, or a rabid dog, you would get the rabies vaccine. Now, just quickly, a quick departure on how that one works. Rabies kills you by traveling very slowly to the brain and eating your mind, leading to basically 100% death, right? Rabies vaccination gives a small element of the pathogen that travels a little more quickly and travels faster than the rabies itself and triggers an immune response that keeps you alive. All right? This is extremely valuable. Would there be a market demand for rabies vaccination? I would suspect so. I think so. You don't have to prod and mandate and push people under those conditions to get the shot. People do it because it's in their best interest. Is that really true of others? And to what extent is it true? And can it sustain an industry so huge, so lucrative, and so powerful that in the spring of 2020, it managed, the only thing in history to ever do anything like this, to persuade 194 nations to destroy its economies all at once in order to prepare for the delivery of their product. That, my friends, is power, industrial power, like we've never seen before. So just to be clear, this is not about being anti-vaccine. This is about wanting vaccines to occupy a normal place within the normal lineup of consumer and medical products in which people can make their own judgments without all the prodding and the subsidies and the mandates and the pushes, the propaganda, the shaming, the wartime disease fears, and all the rest of it that this industry has always relied on from its birth all the way to the present. Thank you very much for listening.